On the 1st of October, 1987, 20-year-old Karina Mullen slid some file folders into a metal cabinet at the police station in the rural town of Central City, Kentucky. Karina glanced at her watch. It was the end of her workday, but she wanted to finish this filing before she left. She had only been working at the police station as an office assistant since she moved to Central City from her family farm about 6 weeks earlier. But in that short time, members of the small local police force had embraced her as one of their own, and she quickly became part of Central City's law enforcement family. Karina finished up her filing and took a few minutes to say goodbye to the officers on duty. It was Thursday, and she had off the next few days, so she told everyone to have a great weekend and said she'd see them soon. After that, she went outside to her car and drove through town towards the apartment she shared with her 2-year-old daughter and another young single mother, who she'd quickly become friends with. Central City was only about 10 minutes from the farm Karina had grown up on, but to her, it felt like kind of a different world. Shops lined the main street, there were a few bars and restaurants in town, and it wasn't too far of a drive to a much bigger city with a thriving nightlife. Karina turned off the main street onto a side road, drove a little further, and then parked in front of her 2-bedroom apartment, which was one of several apartments in a small but crowded complex. Just 6 weeks ago, when she had moved here, this apartment felt like her first real taste of freedom. Now, Karina loved her parents and living on the family farm. But when she had turned 20 very recently, she really wanted to go out on her own, and she wanted to prove to her parents that she could raise her daughter by herself. But things had not quite turned out like she'd hoped. Karina was raising her child while working at the police station and studying to try to get into nursing school, and she just couldn't do it all. In truth, she missed having her mom and dad's help, and so, after only having been in this apartment for a little over a month, she had decided to move back to the farm. Karina stepped into her apartment and walked past the few moving boxes she'd already packed up. She saw her roommate, Angela Smith, getting something to eat in the kitchen. When Karina had dropped the news on Angela that she was leaving to go back to her farm, things had not gone well. Angela felt totally blindsided. She couldn't afford rent by herself, and she had no idea how quickly she could find a new roommate. But Karina had told her she wouldn't just disappear overnight. She would take her time moving out, and she'd try to help Angela get situated with rent before leaving. And so, as a result, the tension had begun to ease between them. This particular evening, the two women were less stressed than usual because it was just them in the apartment. Karina's daughter was at the farm with Karina's parents, and Angela's ex had her daughter for the weekend. So Karina sat down with Angela in the kitchen, and they began chatting about work for a while. But at some point, Angela got a bit giddy and said she really just wanted to hear the latest gossip on Karina's boyfriend. Karina sighed and kind of laughed at herself. She'd recently broken up with her boyfriend, a guy named Jimmy Springer, who she'd had this on-again, off-again relationship with for 8 months. But almost in the same breath as talking about the most recent breakup with Jimmy, Karina told Angela that Jimmy was actually coming by later to spend the night. Karina knew this sounded sort of ridiculous. But even though she had just cut Jimmy loose a few days earlier, she was looking forward to seeing him that night when her daughter was gone, and they could just be alone together. At 9 a.m. the following morning, the 2nd of October, a city worker was driving to a job not far from the center of town when he noticed something that seemed totally out of place. Behind the parking garage used by the Central City Street Department, he saw an old 1977 Chevrolet car. This didn't make much sense, because people from town normally never parked over here, and he knew this car didn't belong to anyone who worked for the street department. The worker parked his truck and hopped out. He wanted to make sure there wasn't someone in the car who might need help or something. He walked towards the car, and at first, he didn't see anybody inside. But when he was just a few feet away, he got a good look at the trunk. And without thinking, the worker turned around, ran to the nearest open shop, asked to use the phone, and called 911-1. Minutes later, Lieutenant Billy Fields of the Central City Police Department arrived at the scene with several other local police officers. Fields got out of his car. He was in his mid-40s and was one of the most experienced cops on the force. He saw the parked 1977 Chevrolet, and from where he was standing, It was clear there were bloodstains on the outside of the trunk. When the other cops looked at Fields and then over at the car he had just stared at, it hit them why he was so upset. They all recognized the Chevy. Belonged to their co-worker and friend, Karina Mullen. Fields walked closer to the car, and he saw blood smears that went into the trunk, like whoever had been bleeding might actually be in the trunk. Lieutenant Fields noticed the trunk was not actually closed all the way, so he reached down and opened it, and as soon as he did, he shouted and just turned away. The other officers walked over to him and saw what he was looking at, and when they did, they all looked away too. They had just seen their friend Karina laying in the trunk, and she was obviously deceased. She was naked, covered in dried blood, with cuts on her hands and neck. Her nose had been smashed in, and there were dark bruises covering most of her body. Fields and the other officers did their best to collect themselves. This was a small-town police force that dealt mainly with petty theft and domestic disputes. They occasionally had to tackle larger drug-related crimes in the area, but none of them had dealt with anything like this. Not to mention, the victim was somebody they all knew and cared about. Fields told them he knew how upsetting this was, but they still had a job to do. So, he and a couple of officers turned back to the trunk and did a more thorough search, while others opened the car and looked inside. Fields found a bloody comforter from a bed stuffed into the trunk next to Karina's body, along with jeans and a pair of women's underwear. There was a lot of blood in the trunk, but Fields said there would be a lot more if she was actually killed in the trunk or in the car, versus being killed elsewhere and then moved to the car. The officers who had searched the rest of the car said they did find a few small bloodstains, but nothing that would indicate the attack had actually taken place inside the vehicle. So, as a result, Lieutenant Fields and the others began to think that Karina must have been murdered somewhere else and then thrown into her trunk and dumped here. The bloody comforter could have been used to carry her from the murder scene to the car, and it only made sense that that comforter would have come from a bedroom. Later that day, after Karina's body had been removed from the trunk and the clothes and the bloody comforter had been bagged as evidence, Lieutenant Fields knocked on the front door of Karina's apartment. A young detective and several uniformed officers stood behind him. Karina's roommate, Angela, opened the door. Even though it was the afternoon, she looked like she'd either just rolled out of bed or hadn't slept all night. Angela had met most of these officers before, and she knew they worked with Karina, and so she asked them if they needed Karina for something work-related. But Fields didn't waste any time. He bluntly told Angela that Karina was dead, and the police needed to search the apartment. Angela backed away from the door, either too shocked or too scared to say anything. Fields told her to wait right there, and then he and the other officers stepped inside, and immediately they felt like they had found the murder scene. There was no sign of forced entry at the door, but they could clearly see bloodstains on the carpet. They followed the bloodstains down a short hallway to a closed door. Fields opened it, and when he and the others stepped inside, they knew this had to be Karina's bedroom. They saw photos of her parents and her little girl, but they also saw a scene of complete horror. Blood spatter covered the wall above the bed, and the sheets looked like they had been soaked in blood. The officers also saw there was no comforter on the bed. There was no question this had to be where Karina had been killed. And so, Fields sent the uniformed officers to canvass the apartment complex. The units were all close together, and the walls looked pretty thin. He thought somebody must have heard a violent attack last night. Fields and the young detective walked back through the apartment, and Fields barked at Angela to join them in the kitchen. Fields was usually a pretty easygoing guy, very calm on the job, but this case had already put him on edge. Fields and the detective sat down with Angela at the kitchen table, and Fields asked her when she had last seen Karina. Angela told him that they had both gone out to a club last night since neither of their daughters were home, and they had gotten back at around maybe midnight. They'd been drinking pretty heavily, so they both went to bed not long after that. Fields snapped right back. He didn't care how much she'd been drinking. This was a small apartment, and the two bedrooms shared a wall. There was no way Angela didn't hear what happened in Karina's room, and there was no way she didn't see the blood stains on the carpet when she woke up. Angela hung her head and fought back tears. And as she did, Fields asked her if she was hiding something from them. She stayed silent for a second and then nodded. She said she hadn't just been drinking the night before. She'd also taken a bunch of painkillers and totally blacked out. She said she was just kind of starting to feel normal again, and so that's why she hadn't heard anything the night before or noticed the bloodstains when she finally woke up. Lieutenant Fields took a breath and eased off a bit. He'd worked enough drug cases in the area to know that the right combination of booze and pills could basically make someone seem dead to the world for a while. This meant there was a chance Angela was actually telling the truth, that she really had no idea what happened over the last 10-12 hours. Fields and the young detective gave Angela a minute to collect herself. Then the young detective asked if there was anyone she could think of in Karina's life who might have wanted to hurt her. Angela said there was one obvious choice: Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Fields and the detective looked at each other. They didn't know a ton about Karina's boyfriend, but they'd heard enough from her at work to know her relationship had its share of drama. Fields asked if Angela knew the last time Karina had seen Jimmy. Angela closed her eyes and tried to fight back tears. She said last night, before Karina went to bed, she had told her to keep the front door unlocked because Jimmy was coming over late and he was going to be spending the night. After leaving the apartment, Lieutenant Fields caught up with the uniformed officers who'd canvassed the area, and they told him that nobody had heard anything strange last night. This made no sense. The complex was small, and the walls looked thin. How had nobody heard anything? Fields said he would try to figure that out later. He told the young detective to go track Jimmy down and call him in for an interview. In the meantime, Fields would have to drive out to Karina's family farm. News of a violent crime like this in such a small town would spread fast, and he did not want Karina's parents to find out that their daughter had been murdered from the television. That afternoon, Fields sat down with Karina's parents in a large, open room with high ceilings in their farmhouse, and he told them the news. Karina's mother broke down immediately, but her father just stared off into space, almost like his mind had gone completely blank. All Fields could do was tell them how sorry he was and how he would do everything in his power to find her killer. He told them that Karina was part of the family at the police department, and nobody would get away with doing this to her. Fields told the parents that he didn't want to intrude on their grief, but he wondered if they knew anything about Karina's latest boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Karina's mom forced herself to stop crying for a second, and she got an angry look on her face. She said Jimmy was no good for her little girl. He was jealous all the time, and he had a bad temper. Karina's dad quickly added that this was not just typical jealous boyfriend stuff that might be expected from a young man. He told Lieutenant Fields that a few weeks earlier, Karina had come to the farmhouse and her face was all red. When he asked her what had happened, she told him that Jimmy had grabbed her, dragged her into the bathroom, and rubbed off all of her makeup with a washcloth because he didn't like her wearing makeup when she was out. Fields assured the parents that the police were already working to bring Jimmy in for questioning. He said he would update them about the case as quickly and as often as he could. He told them again how sorry he was, then said goodbye and walked back outside to his car. On the night of the 2nd of October, so a little over 12 hours after Karina's body had been found, Lieutenant Fields sat with the Central City Chief of Police and the county sheriff in an interview room at the sheriff's department. Fields had been right, and the story of Karina's murder had already made the nightly news in cities all over the area. This was by far the biggest crime to have hit Central City in recent memory. So the chief and the sheriff wanted to make sure they handled everything by the book and that they could control the story in the media as much as possible. Just then, a deputy led Jimmy Springer into the room. Jimmy was 19 years old, tall and skinny, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He currently lived a little less than 2 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, but police had found him staying with a friend in Central City. Jimmy sat down, and right away, the sheriff asked him if he knew why he was there. Jimmy had already heard about Karina, so he responded by saying he had nothing to do with her death. The police chief asked Jimmy where he'd been the night before, blood stains on the carpet when she woke up. Angela hung her head and fought back tears, and as she did, Fields asked her if she was hiding something from them. She stayed silent for a second and then nodded. She said she hadn't just been drinking the night before. She'd also taken a bunch of painkillers and totally blacked out. She said she was just kind of starting to feel normal again, and so that's why she hadn't heard anything the night before or noticed the bloodstains when she finally woke up. Lieutenant Fields took a breath and eased off a bit. He'd worked enough drug cases in the area to know that the right combination of booze and pills could basically make someone seem dead to the world for a while. This meant there was a chance Angela was actually telling the truth, that she really had no idea what happened over the last 10-12 hours. Fields and the young detective gave Angela a minute to collect herself. Then the young detective asked if there was anyone she could think of in Karina's life who might have wanted to hurt her. Angela said there was one obvious choice: Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Fields and the detective looked at each other. They didn't know a ton about Karina's boyfriend, but they'd heard enough from her at work to know her relationship had its share of drama. Fields asked if Angela knew the last time Karina had seen Jimmy. Angela closed her eyes and tried to fight back tears. She said last night, before Karina went to bed, she had told her to keep the front door unlocked because Jimmy was coming over late and he was going to be spending the night. After leaving the apartment, Lieutenant Fields caught up with the uniformed officers who'd canvassed the area, and they told him that nobody had heard anything strange last night. This made no sense. The complex was small, and the walls looked thin. How had nobody heard anything? Fields said he would try to figure that out later. He told the young detective to go track Jimmy down and call him in for an interview. In the meantime, Fields would have to drive out to Karina's family farm. News of a violent crime like this in such a small town would spread fast, and he did not want Karina's parents to find out that their daughter had been murdered from the television. That afternoon, Fields sat down with Karina's parents in a large, open room with high ceilings in their farmhouse, and he told them the news. Karina's mother broke down immediately, but her father just stared off into space, almost like his mind had gone completely blank. All Fields could do was tell them how sorry he was and how he would do everything in his power to find her killer. He told them that Karina was part of the family at the police department, and nobody would get away with doing this to her. Fields told the parents that he didn't want to intrude on their grief, but he wondered if they knew anything about Karina's latest boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Karina's mom forced herself to stop crying for a second, and she got an angry look on her face. She said Jimmy was no good for her little girl. He was jealous all the time, and he had a bad temper. Karina's dad quickly added that this was not just typical jealous boyfriend stuff that might be expected from a young man. He told Lieutenant Fields that a few weeks earlier, Karina had come to the farmhouse and her face was all red. When he asked her what had happened, she told him that Jimmy had grabbed her, dragged her into the bathroom, and rubbed off all of her makeup with a washcloth because he didn't like her wearing makeup when she was out. Fields assured the parents that the police were already working to bring Jimmy in for questioning. He said he would update them about the case as quickly and as often as he could. He told them again how sorry he was, then said goodbye and walked back outside to his car. On the night of the 2nd of October, so a little over 12 hours after Karina's body had been found, Lieutenant Fields sat with the Central City Chief of Police and the county sheriff in an interview room at the sheriff's department. Fields had been right, and the story of Karina's murder had already made the nightly news in cities all over the area. This was by far the biggest crime to have hit Central City in recent memory. So the chief and the sheriff wanted to make sure they handled everything by the book, and that they could control the story in the media as much as possible. Just then, a deputy led Jimmy Springer into the room. Jimmy was 19 years old, tall and skinny, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He currently lived a little less than 2 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, but police had found him staying with a friend in Central City. Jimmy sat down, and right away, the sheriff asked him if he knew why he was there. Jimmy had already heard about Karina, so he responded by saying he had nothing to do with her death. The police chief asked Jimmy where he'd been the night before. Officers waited with him. There was the sense that the chief's trip to Nashville was going to help bring this case to a close and finally get justice for their friend Karina. Finally, late that night, Fields' phone rang. He grabbed it, and he heard the chief's voice on the other end. And the chief said Fields was not going to believe what had just gone down in Nashville. Jimmy had not confessed to the murder, but he had admitted to going into Karina's apartment that night. Fields knew this was a huge deal. It meant Jimmy had flat out lied to the police the first time he spoke to them. But the chief said there was something way bigger than that. Jimmy said he had gone to Karina's bedroom and seen blood, but instead of calling the police, he had driven around town looking for Karina himself, and when he didn't find her, he just went to his friend's house and fell asleep. This had to be one of the most unbelievable, ridiculous alibis the chief or Fields had ever heard in their law enforcement careers. And so, a few minutes later, when Fields hung up the phone, he felt this huge sense of relief. The chief and the sheriff were ready to put together a case against Jimmy, because they too now believed he was the killer. On the 19th of July, 1988, so 9 months after Karina's body had been found, her boyfriend Jimmy went on trial for her murder. Some officers who worked in the state crime lab felt like this case had actually been rushed to trial, because when the lab had finally tested evidence from the case, the results had not tied Jimmy directly to the murder scene, so the case against Jimmy was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. But Fields and other members of the Central City Police believed their case against Jimmy was still strong, and they expected a conviction. After a couple of days, the trial ended, and the jury deliberated for only an hour. Fields sat in the courtroom, feeling a rush of anticipation as the jury foreman read the verdict, and Fields heard the words, "Not guilty." Fields felt like he had just gotten the wind completely knocked out of him. He'd spent a huge part of almost a year doing everything he could to ensure that Jimmy would go to prison for killing Karina. Now, any hope of that was gone. The police officers filed out of the courtroom feeling utterly defeated, and like they had failed their friend and her family. And with 9 months of work basically erased, they had no idea where to restart the investigation. During the weeks following Jimmy's trial, Lieutenant Fields felt like he was scrambling. But he and his team did decide to revisit the possibility that the killer could be Jeffrey Lee Boyd, that drug dealer who may or may not have threatened Karina with a gun. And this time, when they looked into it, they discovered something new about Jeffrey. He was close friends, and maybe even lovers, with Karina's roommate, Angela. The team immediately went back to their early notes from the case, and they quickly found something else they had missed. The medical examiner's toxicology report made it clear that no alcohol or drugs were present in Karina's body when she was killed. But Angela had told Fields and the other detective that she and Karina had been drinking heavily the night of the murder. Fields said he was frustrated with himself. These oversights could be chalked up to a small team handling a case that might be too big for them, but he apologized for what he saw as a massive misstep on his part. Still, they now had a clear connection between the drug dealer Jeffrey and the victim, and they now believed the victim's roommate had lied to them. So in August of 1988, 10 months after the murder, Fields brought in Angela for another interview. But all she could say was that, maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe she only thought Karina was drinking a bunch when they went out, because she herself had been really drunk and on painkillers. Following his talk with Angela, Lieutenant Fields tracked down 25-year-old Jeffrey at his house, and he happened to be there with an 18-year-old drug dealer named Kramer, who cops believed worked for Jeffrey. The two dealers made an odd-looking pair. Jeffrey was this tall, massive guy who had no problem physically intimidating people, while Kramer was skinny and barely stood 5 feet tall. Fields talked to them for a while at the house, but when he got back to the station, he told the chief that both young men had barely said a thing. This seemed par for the course, though, because Jeffrey, who had been questioned many times in the past by police, sort of knew to keep his mouth shut. Even though Jeffrey had started to seem like a strong suspect on the surface, as the investigation went on, Fields was not able to produce enough evidence to convince anyone that they had a case against Jeffrey. And once Jeffrey fell off the radar, the investigation began to dry up. In fact, as broken-hearted as police officers and the people who knew Karina still were, there seemed to be an effort from everybody to just move on, like the only way for the town to heal was to put this horrific murder case behind them, despite it being unsolved. And so, as months and then years went by, there were only two men who seemed to still be actively looking for Karina's murderer. That was her father and Lieutenant Fields. Sometimes Fields would even pick up Karina's dad at the farm, and they would just drive around together, looking for any potential clue that they might have missed. But those clues never surfaced, and the years kept passing by. Eventually, Lieutenant Fields retired from the force, and then, once Fields was gone, Karina's dad convinced the state police to pick up the investigation, and they tried for a time to solve the murder. But eventually, they also let the case go. Finally, after over a decade of searching, Karina's mom convinced her husband that he needed to drop the case too. They could not spend the rest of their lives hunting for a killer that nobody could find. That is not what Karina would have wanted for them. In June of 2006, over 18 years after Karina's murder, Detective Damon Fleming of the Kentucky State Police sat at his desk, digging through old notebooks and file folders. The state police had recently made an effort to revitalize cold cases, and Detective Fleming had been assigned to Karina's murder investigation. Fleming knew the case had long since disappeared from public consciousness, but when he took it over, he had gotten the word out to the media in and around Central City that the investigation had been reopened. And if anybody had information, no matter how insignificant they thought it might be, they should contact the state police. Sitting at his desk, Fleming heard someone call his name. He looked up from the notebook he was reading, and he saw an officer there with this woman who appeared to be in her 30s. And she looked absolutely terrified. Detective Fleming asked what he could do for her, and she said she needed to talk to him in private. Fleming stood up, signaled for the other officer to leave, and then he led the woman into a conference room. He closed the door behind them, and then sat down across from her at a long wooden conference table. As soon as she sat down, the woman kept glancing over her shoulder, like she thought somebody was following her. But Fleming assured her they were totally safe in here, and he asked her why she needed to see him. Tears began running down the woman's cheeks as she cleared her throat, and then she told him her name was Samantha Robinson, and that when she was 16 years old, she had witnessed the brutal murder of Karina Mullen. Detective Fleming sat there silent and almost in awe of this woman. And by the time she stopped talking, he knew that she had given him all of the information he would need to finally close Karina's murder case after almost 20 years. Based on Samantha's story and evidence and interviews from multiple investigations conducted over 18 years, this is what police believe happened to Karina on the night of the 1st of October, 1987. On that night, 16-year-old Samantha Robinson was walking down the middle of a street in Capital City, Kentucky towards her house when she heard a car behind her. Samantha turned and saw headlights rapidly approaching, so she hopped up onto the sidewalk to get out of the way. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt right alongside her. The driver's door and the front passenger door flew open, and two men came out and rushed towards her. The driver grabbed Samantha, and she kicked and screamed, but there was no way she could get out of his grip. The passenger opened up one of the back doors, and the driver shoved Samantha into the back seat, and then slammed the door shut behind her. Samantha looked next to her, and there was the group's leader sitting in the back seat, smiling at her. The car lurched forward, and a few minutes later, it pulled up to Karina's apartment. The back door of the car opened, and the driver and passenger grabbed Samantha and pulled her out of the car and up towards the apartment, while their leader followed behind, holding a metal club in one of their hands. The driver opened the door to Karina's apartment and told Samantha to keep her mouth shut if she wanted to live. The leader walked past them and right to Karina's bedroom, where Karina was sleeping. The driver and passenger followed with Samantha, and then threw Samantha to the bedroom floor. Karina woke up and saw all the people in her room and began to scream, but the leader jumped on top of her and began beating her stomach with the metal club until she went quiet. At this point, the leader climbed off of Karina, off the bed, and motioned to the driver. This man drew a knife from his hip, climbed onto the bed with Karina, and made shallow cuts into Karina's neck, arms, and stomach. After that, the driver with the knife, and then the passenger, and then the leader, all raped Karina. Afterwards, they stepped away from the bed, and for a second, Samantha, who was on the ground, hoped and prayed they would just leave. But the leader raised the metal club, rushed back to the bed, and smashed Karina in the head and nose with it. Karina's nose broke, blood sprayed all over the wall and ran into the sheets, and Karina began to choke, at which point the group just stood there and watched her die. After Karina was dead, the leader told the other two to wrap Karina up in her comforter. They followed the orders and carried Karina in her comforter out of the apartment. The leader picked up Karina's car keys off the bedside table, then yanked Samantha up off the floor and dragged her outside. The leader opened up the trunk of Karina's '77 Chevrolet that was parked out front and told the others to dump Karina inside of it. Then the leader handed the car keys to Samantha and told her if she drove them to the parking garage near the center of town, they might let her live. Shaking and terrified, Samantha did as she was told. She climbed into the driver's seat with the killers and drove them to a spot behind the parking garage in town and parked the car. And then, in a flash, this teenage girl killed the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, leapt out of the car, and threw the keys as far away as she could. By the time the killers knew what had happened, Samantha was already running through the shadows and making her way home. The leader sat in the car for a second and just started laughing. They said there was no way this little girl would ever rat them out. She would spend the rest of her life in constant fear that if she did, they would find her and kill her. And so, all three of the killers got out of Karina's car and walked through town, covered in blood. The driver and the passenger went their own way, and the leader walked home, showered, and went to bed. The following morning, the killer's leader got dressed, grabbed their badge and gun, and headed to their place of work, the police station. The drug dealer Jeffrey Lee Boyd and his 18-year-old friend, Kramer, helped carry out Karina's murder. But their leader, the one who was in charge of the murder, also happened to become the lead investigator on Karina's murder, Lieutenant Billy Fields. It would turn out Lieutenant Fields was at the top of the drug trade in Central City, giving out orders and providing police cover while Jeffrey ran things on the street. But Jeffrey just couldn't keep quiet. One day, while he was hanging out with Karina's roommate, Angela, he let it slip that he had cops working with him and protecting him, and Karina heard all of this. Jeffrey quickly realized he'd made a huge mistake, so, the day before the murder, he got his gun and threatened to kill Karina if she talked, just like the witness described seeing. But Fields thought that was not enough. The only way to be sure they would not get caught was to kill her. Fields and Jeffrey were sadistic, though murder wasn't enough for them. So, when they were driving to Karina's and saw that teenager, Samantha, on the street, they decided to grab her and make her watch what happened next. And what happened next is, they assaulted and killed Karina and forced Kramer to participate. But Karina's roommate, Angela, had been in her bedroom and heard everything that night. But they threatened to kill her if she talked. Jeffrey came up with the story about Angela and Karina going out and drinking and taking pills for Angela to tell the police. Fields also told Jeffrey to threaten everybody who lived in that apartment complex. That's why, when they were asked by police, all those neighbors said they didn't hear anything. After that, Fields made sure to personally overlook whatever needed to be overlooked in the investigation in order to steer it away from him and his partners. Karina's boyfriend, Jimmy, almost turned out to be the perfect patsy for Fields. But in court, Jimmy's lawyers argued that police had bullied and manipulated him into saying things that were not true. And so, he was acquitted. After Jimmy was found not guilty, Lieutenant Fields led the investigation into his own accomplices. But he made sure to steal evidence from the police station to make sure his accomplices didn't actually look guilty. So, eventually, the case went cold. It would take almost 20 years for Samantha to finally get over her fear of Fields and Jeffrey. When she heard the case had been reopened, she went straight to the state police and told them everything. She said she owed it to Karina. Angela ultimately aided the prosecution and was only charged with perjury. She did not serve any jail time. As for the killers, Kramer was sentenced to 60 years in prison, and Jeffrey and Lieutenant Billy Fields were sentenced to life loof. On the 25th of July, 1984, a 35-year-old woman named Xiao Xiaoling stood in her doorway. talking to an agitated man in Liaoyuan City, in northeastern China. The man was a friend of Zhao's husband, Li, and he kept pacing back and forth. He was loud and very animated when he spoke. Zhao glanced over her shoulder and saw her 7-year-old daughter drawing a picture at a small table in the front room, and Zhao turned and asked her husband's friend to please keep his voice down. The man nodded, and then did lower his voice, and then told Zhao everything was going to be okay. By the end of the night, she wouldn't have to worry or keep the secret she was hiding anymore. She just needed to follow the instructions he had given her. The man then said goodbye and wished her luck. Zhao closed the door and just stood there in silence for a second. Then she forced a smile onto her face and turned and walked over to her daughter. Zhao was about 5'3" tall with black hair and dark brown eyes, and her daughter looked a lot like her. Zhao told her daughter she could finish her drawing later because for now she was going to go stay with her uncle for a while. Right away, Zhao's daughter's face lit up and she ran to the door. Zhao followed her and slipped on her favorite pair of shoes. They were red sandals with a low heel. Then she took her daughter's hand and they both walked outside. The pair made their way through the neighborhood that lay on the outskirts of the city, not far from the surrounding mountains. Streets were lined with small gray wooden houses, and Zhao basically knew everybody who lived in these houses. This was a neighborhood where multiple generations of families had grown up right alongside each other. Usually, that was something Zhao loved about this place, that sense of community. But now, all she could imagine were her neighbors staring out at her from their windows, trying to figure out the secret that she was hiding from everyone. After walking for a few more minutes, Zhao's daughter let go of her mother's hand and ran down the street to her uncle's house and then knocked on the door. As this happened, Zhao prayed her brother was actually home. In 1984, nobody where Zhao lived had a car. In fact, even bicycles were seen as a luxury. If people needed to travel for work, they could catch a bus or train from the city center. But typically, they just walked everywhere. The people in this area at the time also did not have telephones. So, if they wanted to get in touch with somebody out of town, they wrote letters. And if they needed to talk to someone close by, they simply walked over to their house to see them. So, it was not uncommon to show up at somebody's house unannounced and to find that nobody was home. But luckily, Zhao saw her brother open up his door and he hugged Zhao's daughter. As this happened, Zhao felt like a huge weight had been lifted. She got to the house, and before her brother could say anything, she told him that she needed him to watch her daughter while she walked to the clinic in town to see a doctor. He said, of course, he'd love to watch his niece, but he asked Zhao, was she okay? Zhao said it was no big deal. She just had a little stomach ache and wanted to get some medicine for it. Zhao then thanked her brother, hugged her daughter tight, and said she loved her. Once her brother closed the door behind them, Zhao turned and started walking. But she did not head to the clinic. Instead, she rushed back home. When Zhao got there, she immediately walked to the back of her house and found her bicycle leaning up against a wall on the small back patio. Zhao's husband, Li, had a good job at a supply company, and Zhao had a well-paying job at a government textile factory. So, together as a two-income family, they were able to afford certain things, like bicycles, that many of their neighbors could not. Zhao rolled the bike to the street in front of her house. She saw the sun beginning to disappear behind the mountains, and she knew it was going to be dark soon. So, she put her red sandals on the pedals and rode off as fast as she could. The following day, around noontime, an old farmer wiped the sweat dripping down his forehead. He spent hours doing back-breaking work, and he needed a rest. He walked south and could hear the running water of the Weian River nearby. The farmer made his way to the edge of his land, and the river came into view. But suddenly, the farmer stopped. Part of the riverbank, about 10 feet from the water, was overgrown with trees and bushes. But through the weeds, the farmer saw something strange laying near one of the trees. He tried to block the sunlight to get a better view, but he still couldn't quite tell what he was looking at. He walked closer and stared at the ground, right near the tree, and suddenly a look of pure horror crossed his face. He took off running across a shallow part of the river and headed toward the city center that was over 12 miles away. He left the river and farmland behind, running faster than he had in years, and he kept on running for the entire 12 miles until he got to the city center and arrived at the local police station. The farmer walked through the door and tried to catch his breath, and as he did, 2 officers quickly walked over to him and asked what was wrong. He told them they needed to come with him to the river right away, but the officers told the farmer to just rest for a minute and explain what was going on here. However, the story the farmer told them was so shocking, they thought the old man must be confused. But the farmer insisted he knew what he was talking about and begged them to follow him. So, eventually, the officers called over a few other cops and told the farmer to lead the way. The farmer, still exhausted from his run, led the police out of the station, and then they all walked 12 miles back to the river. When they finally got there, the 2 officers followed the farmer to a tree on the riverbank, and right away they could see the old man had been telling the truth. But they still didn't want to believe what their eyes were seeing, because laying on the ground, the officers saw a naked, charred corpse. They could tell it was a woman who was maybe a little over 5 feet tall, and she had severe burns all over her body. The burns were so bad that it was impossible to make out her facial features, let alone see any identifying marks. The officers tried to stay calm, but they had never seen anything like this before. They spent most of their shifts breaking up fights in town or occasionally investigating robberies. That was it. The 2 officers walked away from the body and joined the other cops, who also had no experience in a case like this. But they did know they had to search the area for potential clues. So they split into teams, with one group searching the riverbank and the other searching the nearby farmland. On the riverbank, about 20 feet from the body, something caught one of the cops' attention. It was a woman's burned blouse and pants and a pair of red sandals. Just then, another officer called out, and the cops staring at the clothes and the sandals snapped to attention. Then he joined the other group and saw them looking at a single set of footprints on the riverbank. It didn't take them long to match those prints to the red sandals. The police continued to search the area, but they didn't find anything else that stood out. And since they had a body and only one pair of footprints that matched the red sandals they thought they'd figured it out. This woman had come to the river alone, set herself on fire on the riverbank, and taken her own life. The following day, the 27th of July, a detective named Sun Eugene sat at the back of a small, brightly lit meeting room at the local police station. Detective Sun was in his early 30s, had black hair and dark eyes. He listened to a group of officers talking to the police chief about the autopsy report they had received for the body they discovered by the river. Sun had not been a part of the group at the river, but he needed to speak to the chief, so he sat there and waited. The officer said that the autopsy report did not identify the woman, but it gave a pretty clear picture of how she died. The body had not been burned after death. She had black carbon foam in her lungs and blood vessels, and that indicated she had been breathing while she was burning. This meant the fire and related smoke inhalation had killed her, and so these officers were saying they felt like that confirmed their theory that this woman had basically lit herself on fire to commit suicide. At this, Detective Sun, who had been quiet to this point, sat up in his chair and shouted, "I disagree." The officers immediately turned and just glared at him. Some people in town said Detective Sun was smarter than everybody else, but a few of his colleagues thought he was just plain arrogant. One of the officers pointed out that Sun had not been at the river, so he couldn't possibly know what had happened. But the police chief chimed in and asked Sun why he disagreed. Sun nodded and walked to the front of the room. Then, with the captive audience in front of him, he said, "First, self-immolation, setting yourself on fire, was a rare way for somebody to kill themselves. And often, when self-immolation occurred, the person doing it was doing it to make a political statement of some kind. And so, he did not think this woman, who was found in the middle of nowhere and didn't leave a message behind, was making some sort of statement. Before the other officers could argue, Sun said there was actually an easier way to prove this woman didn't kill herself. He said the officers had searched the entire area near the river, but they hadn't found a gas can or any other container that could have held the fuel that burned her. So either this woman doused herself in gasoline and then walked for miles before lighting herself on fire, and Sun said this was way more likely someone else doused her in some sort of fuel, murdered her by setting her on fire, and then ran off with the gas can. The officers just stared at Sun. Even if he was arrogant, most of them admitted he had made a good point. But an officer asked him, well, okay, if somebody else killed her, why was there only one set of footprints, which appeared to be the dead woman's footprints? Detective Sun said that was a great question, and they would need to look into that, but it was hardly a reason to chalk this whole thing up to suicide. Sun told the police chief he was sure they had a murder case on their hands, and he knew he could solve it. And the chief didn't hesitate. He said, okay, they would treat the woman found at the river as a homicide victim, and Detective Sun would lead the investigation. Later that day, Sun walked to the river with several other officers. He held a file folder of photographs that had been taken at the scene the day before. Sun knew that some of his colleagues wished he had kept his mouth shut. It would have been a lot easier if they deemed this a suicide, closed the case, and simply moved on. But Sun was sure he had made the right call. He refused to believe that a woman could just set herself on fire and not leave any trace of how she'd done it or why. And when Sun stared down at the footprints that were still on the Prosecution riverbank, he knew he was right. He crouched down and took out a photograph of the red sandals the police had found there the day before. He glanced between the footprints and the photo, and he knew the officers had been right. The prints matched the sandals, but Sun caught something else the others had missed. He gently pressed his hand down into the ground, not far from the footprints, and he was able to make a handprint. However, the ground was so wet that the moment he removed his hand, that print quickly vanished. It was like the ground kind of ate it back up, like water had washed it away. Sun looked at the photo again and fixated on the heels of the red sandals. They weren't high heels, but they were thick and solid, definitely heavy enough to leave a deeper footprint, whereas a lighter, flatter shoe might not have left a mark at all, and they would have just vanished like his handprint. Sun still did not have a clear picture of what had happened here, but he knew things would become a whole lot clearer as soon as he identified the victim, the dead woman who had worn those red sandals. The following morning, Detective Sun was sitting at his desk studying the crime scene photos when he heard somebody call his name. Sun looked up and saw an officer standing next to a man who looked like he had not slept in a long time. Sun asked if this man needed his help, and the man told him he was really worried. His older sister, Xiao, had been missing for days. Sun looked around and saw there was an empty office in the corner. So he scooped up the file folder with the crime scene photos inside and then led Xiao's brother into the office and closed the door behind them. Once, they sat down at the small table inside the office. Sun asked the man when was the last time he had seen his sister. He said Xiao had dropped off his niece a couple of days ago before going to the clinic, but she never came back. So he brought his niece to his other sister's house and then spent a whole day walking everywhere and talking to everyone to see if they had heard from Xiao, but nobody had. Sun looked at the man with pity in his eyes. The man was already so upset, and Sun hated that he was about to cause him a whole lot more pain. Sun opened the file folder and pulled out photos of the woman's blouse and the red sandals that had been found at the river. He asked Xiao's brother if he recognized the clothing. Xiao's brother stared at the photos and started shaking his head like he didn't want to accept what he was seeing, but eventually He looked up and said, "Yes, those are definitely Zhao's clothes." Sunday told the man he was very sorry to say this, but they had recently found his sister's body near the river, and he believed someone had murdered her. Zhao's brother immediately broke down, sobbing. Sun gave the man a couple of minutes to compose himself, and then he apologized for pressing him at a time like this, but he wanted to know why Zhao's husband had not already reported his wife missing. Zhao's brother wiped the tears away from his face. Then he said that Zhao's husband, Li, was on a business trip hours away, so he wouldn't have had any idea about what was going on. Detective Sun promised he would find whoever had done this, and then he asked Zhao's brother to please not speak publicly about his sister's death. Sun believed holding back information could be crucial in identifying the killer. Zhao's brother nodded and said that he and his other sister would not say word. Later that day, Detective Sun walked through Zhao's house to her and her husband's bedroom. Now, this was not a crime scene, but Sun hoped something there might point him in the right direction. He searched the dresser and bedside tables, but didn't find anything that stood out. He crossed the room and opened up the drawer of a wooden desk that was pressed against the wall. Inside, he found playing cards, photos, and a blue hardcover notebook. He opened up the notebook and looked at the first page, and quickly realized this was Zhao's diary. Sun flipped through the diary and found the last entry. It was dated just a few days before her death. He read the entry, and it really took him by surprise, because basically it was one complaint after another about her husband Li, and all these complaints basically boiled down to the same thing. Zhao clearly believed that Li cared more about money than about his family. Detective Sun bagged the diary as evidence. Now, he just needed to track down Zhao's husband. A few hours later, Detective Sun and members of his team met with Li's boss at the supply company where he worked, and Sun got right to the point and said the police needed to find Li right away. They knew he was traveling for business, so Sun asked where Li had gone and where he was staying, but the boss got this confused look on his face. He said Li was not on a business trip. Li had been away from work, but because he had said he had this family issue that he needed to attend to. Sun didn't say anything in response to this, but this seemed like a major revelation. It meant Li had very likely lied about where he was, at least to his boss and to his brother-in-law. Sun asked to see where Li worked, and the boss led the police to an office filled with several desks. He then pointed them to Li's desk, and then left the cops on their own. Sun began rifling through Li's desk, and under a stack of papers he found a photograph of a woman, and it was not Zhao. Then Detective Sun caught a break that could only happen in a small, tight-knit community, where basically everybody knew each other. One of the other officers who was with Sun looked at the photo of this woman and said he recognized her. He couldn't remember her name, but he was sure she had been Li's girlfriend when they were younger. Detective Sun felt like he was on to something big. He already suspected Li in this murder, and now this piece of evidence helped him come up with a theory. Maybe Li murdered his wife, and then went on the run to be with his old girlfriend. And lying about the business trip would have given Li cover to be out of town for a couple of days before anybody thought something suspicious was going on. For the rest of the day, investigators spoke to Li's friends, and finally they found a man who could identify the woman in the photo. The man told them that the woman was definitely Li's ex-girlfriend, but she had gotten married years ago and moved to a city that was about a 3-hour train ride away. So, the following morning, 2 days after Zhao's body had been found, Sun took a train ride, and he found Li's ex-girlfriend at her house. But he realized pretty quickly this was a waste of time. Li's ex answered all of Sun's questions, but she said she had not seen Li or even exchanged letters with him in over a decade. So Sun turned right around and hopped back on the train for the long ride back home. During this ride, Sun felt frustrated. He felt totally lost. Li really seemed to have fled, but now Sun had no idea where to look for him, and he knew Li had at least a couple of days' jump on him. Moreover, traveling by train through smaller towns in this region would allow Li to almost completely disappear, because a lot of those trains didn't require a passenger to provide identification. Sun could ask for help from other police departments, but Li could be almost anywhere in China by this point. Hours later, Sun got back to the police station, and he was surprised when the chief greeted him with a huge smile on his face. Sun asked him if there had been some miraculous break in the case while he was gone. The chief said no, nothing like that had happened. However, he did have something exciting to show him. The chief walked with Sun out back behind the station, and immediately Sun's face lit up. The other officers were all out there, standing next to a row of brand new bicycles. The chief told Sun he had met with members of the city government and discussed the murder case they were dealing with, and he told them it was larger in scope than anything they had ever dealt with. So, the city government wanted to help the police solve the crime, and they figured by giving them bicycles that would help them cover more ground and also just generally speed up the process. Even though Sun had spent most of the day feeling really bad about his investigation, feeling like it was going nowhere, now, he couldn't help but feel rejuvenated. These bikes were a huge deal. It meant his team could travel much farther and talk to more people far more efficiently. And Sun reminded himself that this was a community where almost everybody knew everybody. So someone out there had to know something about Li that could point the police in the right direction. They just had to go out there and find that person. Over the next several days, Sun and his team were out in force on their bikes, speaking to Li's friends, his family, and just people all over the community. And finally, about a week after the discovery of Zhao's body, their work paid off. Police got a tip from a factory worker in town. The man didn't say much, but he told them to take a closer look into a robbery that had taken place at the factory's warehouse. Sun was quite familiar with this robbery. It had been a big deal in town. A large quantity of expensive steel pipes had been stolen from that warehouse, but the case had gone unsolved for months. Sun didn't see how stolen pipes could possibly connect to Zhao's murderer, but he'd been desperate for any new leads, and now he felt like he had one. So he took his bike and rode right over to the warehouse. When Sun walked inside, he saw men driving lifts through this vast open space, transporting materials across the floor to get ready for shipping. One of the shift managers waved at Sun and then trotted across the floor to meet him. The guy was in his late 20s, and he introduced himself as Ho Lechong. He led Sun into a nearby office that he said would be quieter than the warehouse floor. Once inside, Sun took a seat at a desk across from Ho, and right away asked him what he knew about the missing steel pipes. Ho said he didn't know much, just that 8 tons of steel had been taken. Also, he said whoever pulled the job must have had access to the warehouse equipment, trucks, and a team of people. Ripping off that much steel was not a fast or easy job. The detective agreed it must have been an enormous undertaking. So he asked Ho if there was anybody he could think of who might have been capable of pulling something like that off. All of a sudden, Ho seemed nervous. Sun picked up on it and asked if he was okay. In a quiet voice, Ho said he did have an idea about who was behind the robbery, but he was afraid to say. Sun leaned forward and told Ho he needed to talk, because otherwise people would think he was covering up for a criminal. Ho nodded and then said there was a man police needed to look into. He was a guy who worked for a local supply company, and his name was Li Shangdong. Detective Sun felt like he had just been given a huge gift. It looked like he could have a clear connection between the warehouse robbery and Li, his murder victim's husband, who apparently had gone on the run. A couple weeks later, in early August, Detective Sun and his team continued to collect more information on Li's possible involvement in the warehouse robbery, but they still weren't any closer to tracking him down. Sun sat at his desk, poring over his notes from the robbery and the murder case like he did every day. And suddenly, he heard someone run into the building, screaming. It was a man who was dripping with sweat and looked like he might pass out. Sun ran over to him, grabbed the man a chair so he could sit down, and asked him what was wrong. The man told him he had been out walking in the mountains just outside of town, and he saw these 4 guys pour gasoline over another man and then light him on fire. For a second, Sun just stood there in shock, but then he snapped out of it, got the exact location of where this man had been, and then he rallied his team together. The officers all ran outside, got on their bikes, and rode off to investigate their second burned body in a matter of weeks. The area where this man had come from, where he had seen this guy get lit on fire, was about 9 miles away from where Zhao had been found. And when the investigators arrived there, they left their bikes and walked down this long tree-lined path toward a clearing near the foot of a mountain. As they got closer, the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Eventually, the investigators walked into a clearing, and there they were, quite surprised to find 4 men still standing over a body that had smoke rising from it. The men's heads were bowed almost in reverence. Detective Sunday immediately began to approach these men to potentially apprehend them, but none of the men tried to flee the scene like he expected them to. Instead, when they noticed him coming, one of these men just told the detective that nothing illegal was going on here. The police had simply stumbled onto a sacred ritual. Now, Detective Sun was not the most religious guy, but he was pretty sure no legal rituals included burning someone alive. But the man explained to him they were not burning someone who was alive. They were burning a dead body. All of them were miners, and their friend had died in a mining accident. They believed that someone who died in an accident should not be buried in a cemetery. Instead, the body had to be burned. Sun stared at the man. He had no idea what to think about this. He would need to check with the mine to see if someone really had died in an accident. And he would need to research religious customs to see if these men were telling the truth. And on top of all that, he now had absolutely no idea if this burning body had any connection to Xiao's murder. But as Sun stood there, looking at the burnt body on the ground, something hit him. It was so obvious that he got mad at himself for taking this long to think of it. Just like with Xiao, the man on the ground was so badly burned that it would be impossible to identify him by his looks. Sun turned to one of the other officers, and he could barely contain his excitement. He said he had just realized that the reason Xiao's killer had burned her was so she would be totally unrecognizable. And more importantly, because police had kept the news of Xiao's death out of the media, the killer probably believed Xiao still had not been identified. And suddenly, Sun had a plan to draw the killer out of hiding. Other members of Sun's team dealt with the body that was found near the mountain, and they would quickly discover the miners had been telling the truth about what they were doing. And as bizarre and unsettling as the ritual had seemed to Sun, it had actually been a huge help to his investigation. And he quickly put the first part of his new plan into action. Sun visited with Zhao's brother and sister. He asked them to start talking publicly about how they were both going to be interviewed soon by the police about a possible murder. Sun felt certain that the news that Zhao's brother and sister were going to meet with the cops would get back to the killer. And Sun believed that the killer, at that point, would reach out to Zhao's siblings in an attempt to keep them from speaking to the police. And it would not take long for Sun to be proven right. 3 days after Sun set his plan in motion, Zhao's sister walked out of her house and found a letter taped to her window. She read it and immediately ran to her brother's house. Then, together, they brought the letter to Detective Sun. The letter was from Zhao's husband, Li. It said that he and Xiao were together and they were okay, but they had gotten mixed up in something pretty bad, so they had to flee the city for now. They knew their daughter would be taken care of for the time being, and they'd get back in touch as soon as it was safe. Li closed it out by telling his sister-in-law to burn the letter. When Sun read this letter, he knew they were close to solving this case. It would take Sun and his team a bit more time to tie everything together, but Sun would figure out exactly what happened to Xiao. Based on the letter Zhao's sister received, the crime scene evidence, and the interviews conducted throughout the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Xiao on the 25th of July, 1984. The killer stood next to their bicycle at the end of Zhao's street as the sun set behind the mountains. They heard bike tires on the road and saw Xiao coming their way. The killer smiled at Xiao, got on their bike, and started riding right alongside her. As it got darker, the killer pulled in front of Xiao and led her towards the river, not too far from their neighborhood. As the killer did this, they told Xiao they wouldn't have to ride much further, and soon they would both be able to forget about the secret they were both hiding. The killer and Xiao reached the riverbank, and from there they could see farmland on the other side of the river. The killer said they would need to cross the river and get to that farmland. So Xiao got off her bike and laid it on the ground, as did the killer, and then she and the killer walked across the river, which was very shallow. When they reached the other side and were on that riverbank, The killer's footprints very quickly disappeared from the wet ground. However, Xiao did not. Xiao began to head up for the farmland, but the killer grabbed her by the arm, leaned in close, and whispered something in her ear. As soon as they did, Xiao's eyes went wide and she began to tremble in fear. She shoved the killer and tried to run, but the killer grabbed her from behind, threw her to the ground, and ripped off her shirt and pants. The killer sexually assaulted Xiao. The whole time, Xiao remained quiet and submissive, perhaps hoping that when this was over, she'd be let go. But no. When the killer was done, they wrapped their hands around Xiao's neck and began choking her. Xiao coughed and fought for air, but eventually everything went black. The killer tossed Xiao's clothes right next to her and then walked to the nearby farm where they'd hidden a gas can. They returned to the riverbank and poured gasoline all over Xiao. Then they stepped several feet away from her, put the gas can down, lit a match, and threw it on Xiao. Suddenly, Xiao woke up screaming. She felt her skin burning and peeling away from her. She was engulfed in flames. Xiao heard the river running nearby, and on instinct she got up and ran towards the sound. Her red sandals fell off and she stumbled forward. The killer looked on in shock. They couldn't believe Xiao had woken up. Eventually, the killer just ran towards her, not really sure what they were going to do. But before they reached her, Xiao had collapsed on the riverbank near a tree, still engulfed in flames. Xiao would let out one final scream, and then she would die. The killer waited several more minutes and just watched Xiao's body continue to burn. Then they grabbed the gas can, walked back across the water, picked up the bikes, and disappeared into the darkness. It would turn out Ho Ling, the warehouse worker, who told Detective Sunday that the steel pipe robbery could have been committed by Xiao's husband, Li, was telling the truth. Li really had robbed the warehouse, but Ho was his partner in crime. Ho had masterminded the robbery, and then Li had sold the goods directly to a company he often worked with as a supplier, making them both a ton of money. Xiao's big secret, the one she had been desperately trying to hide from everybody, was that she knew what Ho and her husband had done. Because a couple of months after the robbery, Li had panicked and told Xiao everything. Xiao was disgusted and couldn't believe he had put his family in jeopardy just to make a quick buck. When Ho caught wind of all this drama, he decided he would step in and try to handle it. So he came up with this plan for Li to tell everybody he was going on a business trip. And then in reality, he would just go on the run. He would disappear from town. Xiao was aware of this plan, and she was under the impression that at some point, she and her daughter would also basically go on the run, connect with Li, and they would start a new life somewhere else. That's basically what Ho had promised them. But on the 25th of July, the day Xiao was killed, Ho went to see Xiao at her house. He told her that Li had actually come back into town undercover. Ho said he could lead her to him, and then she and her husband could escape before the law caught up with them. Then, once they were safe, they could send for their daughter and start their new life. However, later that night, when Ho and Xiao got across the river, it was Ho who whispered in Xiao's ear that Li wasn't there, and that in fact he'd lured her here just to make sure she never told the police anything about the robbery. Then it was Ho who sexually assaulted Xiao and burned her to death. But that was not the only horrific crime Ho had committed, because Li had followed his advice and planned to leave town and go into hiding like he suggested. But right before Li was about to leave town, which was days before Xiao was killed, Ho met up with Li, beat him to death with a hammer, and then disposed of his body outside of the city. So, after all of this, Ho believed he'd gotten away with 2 murders. But when that letter that was supposedly written by Li arrived at Xiao's sister's house, Detective Sunday compared it to other letters Li had written, and he quickly realized the handwriting didn't match. So Sunday soon began working with a handwriting analysis expert and compared the letter to documents and correspondence from Li's family and friends, and from employees who worked at the warehouse that had been robbed. And that's how Sunday figured out that Ho had actually written that letter. Police would eventually locate Li's body, at which point Ho would confess to everything. Ho was sentenced to death and was executed, all to cover up some stolen pipes. These are real stories, though sometimes names, locations, and details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.